The photograph was taken on February 23, 1945, 5 days into the battle. 6 Marines raising the American flag on the summit of Mount Suribachi. It became the most reproduced photograph in the history of American journalism. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It became the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Washington. What the photograph doesn't show is the man who made that moment so much harder than it should have been. His name was Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was the Japanese general commanding the defense of Iwo Jima, and he had made a decision before the battle that no Japanese commander had made before him. A decision that contradicted everything Japanese military doctrine said about how to defend an island. He decided not to fight on the beaches. The Japanese defensive doctrine that American forces had faced across the Pacific was built on a single principle: meet the enemy at the water's edge. Use the moment of maximum American vulnerability, the landing itself, when men are in open boats approaching an exposed beach, to inflict maximum casualties. Die fighting in the open. Kuribayashi read the after-action reports from every island battle that had preceded Iwo Jima. He saw the pattern. The beach defense worked well for 1 day, sometimes 2. Then American naval gunfire and air support destroyed the defending positions. Then the Americans moved inland. Then the island fell. He decided to build something different. 18 kilometers of tunnels, 1,500 rooms carved into volcanic rock, gun positions that could disappear underground and reappear elsewhere. A defense designed not to stop the Americans on the beach, but to make them pay for every meter of the interior, from below, from the sides, from positions that naval guns couldn't reach because they were inside the rock itself. It took 36 days and 26,000 American casualties to take an island 8 miles long. The general who built that defense was never found. To understand what Kuribayashi accomplished at Iwo Jima, and why it was so different from what came before, you need to understand the pattern of island battles in the Pacific, and why that pattern had become predictable enough to be exploited. The island-hopping campaign that American forces had been conducting since Guadalcanal in 1942 had produced a consistent operational logic. American naval superiority meant that any island the Japanese defended would eventually be surrounded and cut off from resupply. American material superiority meant that any position the Japanese held on the surface would eventually be destroyed by naval gunfire, airstrikes, or artillery. The question was never whether the Americans would take the island. It was how long it would take, and how much it would cost. Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved in response to that logic, but not enough. The Banzai Charge, the mass infantry attack that expressed the warrior ethos, but reliably produced catastrophic Japanese casualties against prepared American positions, had been abandoned by most commanders after Tarawa. The beach defense had been refined. Underground positions had become more common, but the underlying assumption remained that the defense was about inflicting casualties during the landing and the initial push inland, and that the inevitable defeat was something to be met with maximum sacrifice rather than maximum delay. Kuribayashi rejected that assumption. He had studied in the United States. He had traveled across the country and understood American industrial capacity in the same way Yamamoto had, as something that made a war of attrition against America strategically hopeless for Japan. But where Yamamoto had concluded that Japan needed a decisive early victory to force a negotiated peace, Kuribayashi had concluded something different and more limited: that his job was not to win, but to make the cost of taking Iwo Jima high enough to affect American political will for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. He was building a delay, not a victory. A delay measured in American casualties. Tadamichi Kuribayashi was 53 years old when he arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944. He was a cavalry officer who had served as military attaché in the United States and Canada in the 1920s, spoke English, and had written letters home to his family about American cities and American people, with a warmth that was unusual for a Japanese officer of his generation. He also knew, with complete clarity, that he was going to die on Iwo Jima, that there would be no rescue, no relief, no possibility of evacuation. He wrote to his family before the battle with the specificity of a man who understood exactly what was coming and had made his peace with it. What distinguished him from the dozens of other Japanese commanders who died in island battles was what he did with the time between his arrival and the American landing. 8 months of preparation that transformed a volcanic island into something the American planners had not anticipated, and the American troops would remember for the rest of their lives. The tunnel system was the foundation. Iwo Jima's volcanic rock was hard enough to hold excavations, but workable enough to dig. Kuribayashi set his men to work immediately, creating a network that eventually extended more than 18 kilometers and included rooms for command posts, hospitals, ammunition storage, and troop quarters that could shelter his men from the naval bombardment that he knew would precede the landing. The surface positions were designed to be temporary, fought from, then abandoned when American fire made them untenable, with the defenders retreating underground through the tunnel system to appear at a different position. The Americans would take a position. The position would be empty. The Japanese defenders would be somewhere else. This required a different kind of discipline than the beach defense. It required men to give up ground deliberately, to retreat in an organized way rather than fighting to the death in place, to accept the psychological difficulty of abandoning a position that felt defensible in order to continue the battle from a position that was actually defensible. It also required suppressing the Japanese military culture that valued the dramatic last stand over the effective delay. Kuribayashi issued explicit orders against banzai charges. Ammunition was too scarce for mass attacks that would fail. Every bullet had to cost the Americans something. Sergeant William G. Nost, a Marine combat cameraman who filmed the flag raising on Suribachi, and whose footage became the companion image to Joe Rosenthal's famous photograph, was killed 9 days after filming that moment, in exactly the kind of combat that Kuribayashi had designed. G. Nost entered a cave complex on the northern end of the island with a group of Marines clearing positions. He never came out. His body was never recovered. His commanding officer, Captain David Severance, whose Easy Company raised the flag on Suribachi, described in his memoir the nature of the fighting in the northern end of the island, the part that Kuribayashi had most thoroughly prepared. What Kuribayashi built in the north was unlike anything we had trained for. You would take a position, and it would be empty, and then fire would come from a position 50 yards away that hadn't been there before. You would clear a tunnel, and the next day men would come out of it again. The ground itself seemed to be fighting. We were not fighting men in positions. We were fighting a system that kept producing men from unexpected places. Every one of our casualties in the north was the result of a position we hadn't seen until it fired. Severance's description captures what Kuribayashi had accomplished. Not the destruction of American forces, but the systematic exhaustion of them, position by position, in a terrain that had been engineered to produce maximum cost for minimum progress. If this is giving you a different way to think about what it means to fight a battle you know you're going to lose, subscribe and hit the bell. New video every week at this level of detail. Back to the story. The naval bombardment that preceded the Iwo Jima landing was the longest and heaviest of any Pacific Island assault. 3 days of continuous naval gunfire and airstrikes designed to destroy Japanese defensive positions before the Marines landed. It destroyed the surface positions. The underground positions were untouched. When the Marines landed on February 19, 1945, the first hours were deceptively quiet. Japanese fire was light. The beach was taken without the catastrophic casualties that had marked other landings. Marine commanders began to think the bombardment had been more effective than expected. Then the fire started from the north. The positions that opened up were not on the beach. They were inland, in the volcanic ridges and draws that Kuribayashi had spent 8 months fortifying. They were positions that the naval gunfire had not reached because they were below ground, or positioned so that the angle of fire from the ships couldn't hit them directly. The battle that followed was, by the measure of American casualties per day per square kilometer, the most costly engagement American forces fought in the entire Pacific War. 26,000 American casualties, dead and wounded, over 36 days on an island 8 miles long and 4 miles wide. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz after the battle said something about Iwo Jima that has been quoted ever since. Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. What is less often quoted is what he implied, that the valor was required because the opposition was extraordinary. Nimitz was not complimenting the Marines in spite of the difficulty. He was acknowledging that the difficulty itself was achievement, not American, but Japanese. Specifically, Kuribayashi's. The island was declared secure on March 26, 1945. The battle had lasted 36 days, compared to the optimistic pre-battle estimate of 5 days. American planners had projected approximately 15,000 casualties. The actual figure was 26,000. Japanese casualties were approximately 18,000 killed, out of a garrison of approximately 21,000. Fewer than 1,100 Japanese surrendered, one of the lowest surrender rates of any Pacific battle. Kuribayashi had built a defense that produced exactly what he had designed it to produce: maximum American casualties for maximum delay. What Kuribayashi had not anticipated, or what he had anticipated and accepted, was the effect on his own men. The tunnel system kept them alive longer than a surface defense would have. It also kept them underground, in volcanic heat, without adequate food or water, for weeks. The conditions in the tunnels in the final days of the battle were described by the few survivors who eventually emerged as beyond anything they had imagined when they entered them. Kuribayashi's final communication, on March 17, 1945, reported that his forces were down to their last resources and would make one final attack. He was never found after that date. His body was never identified. Whether he died in a final charge, was killed in the tunnels, or committed suicide is unknown. The American military posthumously promoted him to full admiral, a rare honor for an enemy commander, in recognition of the effectiveness of his defense. General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith, who commanded the overall Marine assault on Iwo Jima, and who had commanded amphibious operations across the Pacific, described Kuribayashi in his post-war memoir with a directness that his public statements during the war had not permitted. Of all the island commanders we faced, Kuribayashi was the most redoubtable. He understood our tactics better than most of our own officers understood his. He designed his defense specifically to defeat what he knew we would do: the heavy bombardment, the beach assault, the push inland with armor. He countered each of those elements with a specific response that our planning had not accounted for. I have faced many opponents in my career. I have never faced one who made me feel, as the battle progressed, that he was always slightly ahead of my decisions. Smith's account captures something that the victory narrative of Iwo Jima tends to obscure: that the battle was as difficult as it was not because of Japanese fanaticism, the quality that American accounts most commonly attributed to Pacific resistance, but because of Japanese intelligence. Kuribayashi had studied his adversary and built a defense tailored to defeat what that adversary would do. Iwo Jima has a specific significance for American communities that goes beyond the iconic photograph. The Marine Corps units that fought at Iwo Jima included soldiers from every American community, and disproportionately from communities that were fighting for a country that did not fully recognize their citizenship. Native American Marines served as code talkers, whose transmissions Kuribayashi's intelligence could never break. African American Marines served in support roles that brought them under the same fire as the combat units, in a segregated military that would not be integrated for another 3 years. Hispanic Marines were present throughout the battle. Men from the Southwest, from Texas, from New Mexico, from California, from the barrios of Los Angeles and San Antonio. Their names appear in the casualty lists and in the unit rosters of Easy Company and the other formations that fought through the northern ridges where Kuribayashi had concentrated his most elaborate defenses. For the Hispanic communities in the United States that sent their sons to Iwo Jima, the battle was not an abstraction. It was specific. It was names they knew. And the general who made that battle so costly, Kuribayashi, deserves to be understood not as a symbol of enemy fanaticism, but as what he actually was: a commander of exceptional intelligence who studied his adversary and built a defense that forced those men to earn every meter of that island. The story of Kuribayashi at Iwo Jima raises a question that military history rarely addresses directly. What does it mean to command well in a battle you know you will lose? Kuribayashi's answer was specific and practical. It means designing your defense to achieve the maximum possible effect, given the resources available, without the distraction of hoping for an outcome that isn't possible. He did not defend Iwo Jima hoping to win. He defended it hoping to make the cost high enough to matter. Whether it did matter is a question historians still debate. The planning for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, had projected American casualties in the millions. The atomic bombs that ended the war before that invasion took place made the question moot. But in the planning sessions where those projections were made, Iwo Jima was a data point. The 26,000 casualties on an island 8 miles long were one of the inputs that went into the calculation of what invading Kyushu and Honshu would cost. Kuribayashi's defense contributed to the environment that produced the decision to use the atomic bomb. Whether that was the outcome he was trying to produce, whether he understood that his goal was not to stop the invasion of the home islands, but to make the Americans unwilling to attempt it, is something his letters and communications do not fully answer. What they do answer is the question of what kind of commander he was. A man who wrote to his children about what he hoped for them. A man who ordered his officers not to waste ammunition on charges that would fail. A man who built 18 kilometers of tunnels so that his men would survive long enough to make the Americans pay the maximum price for an island he knew he was going to lose. He never came back from those tunnels. The flag went up on Suribachi on February 23rd. The battle lasted another 5 weeks. And somewhere in the volcanic rock of the northern ridges, the general who made all of it so hard simply disappeared.